The sky above us has not changed much in millions of years, but what has changed is how we see that sky, and also how much of it we see, and that's changed forever just in our lifetimes. A revolution in astronomy has taken place. As astronomers and physicists venture beyond the visual spectrum, beyond visible light, and begin to see the actual shape and the form of the universe. The little pinpoint stars that we've been staring at for centuries are literally just the tip of the iceberg, like the eyes in the human body. The shape of the body of the universe itself has now been partially revealed, and it's beautiful indeed, of course. Astrologers have always followed astronomical research, such as the discovery of Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and they've done it with open ears and with a mind, which is what we do, to interpret what this or that astronomical discovery might mean astrologically. We now have astrological interpretations for the outer planets, even for the asteroids and so on. But this has not been as true for the landmark discoveries of deep space objects like pulsars and quasars, various radio and X-ray sources, black holes, and so forth. What do they mean? Because perhaps it's because so much was discovered in such a relatively short time that astrologers have just not had time to catch up with the astronomers. Some 35 to 40 years have passed since I first did research for some of this material. And what I'm discussing here now was first published in a book in 1976 under the title Astrophysical Directions. Nothing of similar scope astrologically has appeared since that time. Aside from the interest of a few astrologers in one or two of the deep space concepts, there has been almost no mention of this material. There's, no echo has returned. With that in mind, I feel it's important to once again make these astronomical discoveries available, to astrologers, and hopefully in an easy-to-use and illustrated format. In addition, all of the more important fixed stars and the deep space objects like black holes and quasars and so forth, I've included them here along with their familiar zodiac positions, rather than just give you the equatorial coordinates that are used by astronomers, which astrologers don't really know much about. That way, as you read about a particular celestial object, you can look that point up and see where it is in your own natal chart. Now, to begin with, I'd like to share with you a few experiences and thoughts concerning the structure in space that's beyond our solar system, and just how it might be of value astrologically for learning more about who we are and what on earth we might be here for. I first became interested in deep space astrology when I was exploring heliocentric astrology. That was way back in the early 1970s. And heliocentric astrology is the astrology of our entire solar system, of which Earth is one part. Early on, I was amazed at the difference between my standard geocentric natal chart, the astrology chart that's been used for centuries, between that and some of the other astrological coordinate systems, astronomical coordinate systems, such as I mentioned, the heliocentric and also what I call local space charts, which are the plotting of a birth moment and the planets in azimuth and altitude. Now, at that time, my interest in space beyond, in the space surrounding our solar system was minimal. I was literally put off by the billions of stellar objects out there, and on a more basic level, just by the ideas of coldness and blackness that I had been brought up with. I'd been programmed to associate with outer space since I was a child. All I knew is I sure didn't want to go out there. Distant space, at least in the 1950s when I was brought up, somehow represented the epitome of otherness and foreign to me. I was embarrassed, in terms of astrological usage, by all of the books I had read on the fixed stars, with the possible exception of L. Edward Jandro's book, which was called, quote, The Stars, unquote. Now, how was I to determine the significance of these billions of stars and use them in my practice, or even a few hundred of them, when I already had enough difficulty just using the 9 planets, or nine bodies? And then something unexpected happened to me, and this is what I'm telling you about. I had a dream. It was a very special dream. It was not my ordinary nighttime dreams, which I don't have all that much, but it was one of those dreams that are more real than my waking consciousness. And it was a dream that took months for me to understand and absorb. It was placed deep within my consciousness. In fact, it was almost like a kind of vision. And in this dream, the astrologer L. Edward Jandro, who I had been studying for years, appeared to me, and his eyes were filled with light. Moreover, there were like rays or stalks of light coming out of his eyes and projecting into space far. And this strange being just said one word, "Look." And with his arm, he turned and pointed up to the night sky. And I looked up, and I looked out there into the darkness. And as I opened my eyes, I saw that the sky was filled with brilliant points of light. The stars and all of this starry material were clustered together to form the great glowing arch of the Milky Way, our galactic plane. Now, in my dream, it was wondrous beyond description. And in that instant, when I looked, my heart somehow went out from me, and it too filled this bright hall of space. Never again after that dream have I had the feeling of being here on Earth, warm and trembling before the cold and the blackness of outer space. In that instant, I became the space and the light, and somehow I reversed my polarity or changed my attitude. I understood that in that instant, in that moment, what I understood was that I was a living representative of this mother galaxy. I was its child. Or in other words, I was the being from outer space that I'd always wondered about. Furthermore, I had always been this way. And from that night forward, I began to venture beyond the zodiac in an inquiry as to the nature and the structure of this universe that we live in, that we represent. And so, in what follows, at least in brief form, is what I found. Most important, as I mentioned, is the fact that we are an integral part of the cosmos, not just some lonely outpost. In fact, each of us is a node, some kind of information aggregate, and the universe is in intimate contact with itself, perhaps only through us, through our eyes. We are part of the cosmic information conduit that exists. we're the eyes of the universe. Maybe another way to say it is that the universe or the cosmos sees through our eyes. It sees itself through our eyes. It knows itself through us, meaning that we're not foreign. We're part of it. The manifold nature of distant cosmic events, events that are happening somewhere out there in space, they're represented through our very self in our lives down here on Earth. There's no separation. It lives through us. There's not only a correlation between these seeming remote cosmic events out there and our person. It's not just an association or a correlation, but it's an identity as well. Information coming from the galactic center and perhaps elsewhere, carried by electromagnetic and gravitational radiation from every last star and cosmic plane and event, that passes through us at all times. We are in some way a node or information complex embedded in the matrix or web of manifestation. In other words, we're looking at ourselves. Now, all of that may sound pretty heady, pretty intellectual. But the overpowering idea that occurred when I made some acquaintance with the universe and with its structure is that there really is no difference between out there in distant space and in here on Earth in our bodies. In other words, we're already out there. We are and have always been in deep space, and we've been there from eternity until now. Our world, our very self, and relationships are a perfect reflection of what is, and also what is happening way out there. It's not an analogy, but an identity. Black holes, supernovae, quasars, pulsars, and all of that deep space stuff are not just remote cosmic events, but this identical story, their story, is also represented, reflected, lived and acted out each day in our lives by those of us living here on Earth. It seems that information circulates, circulates through the universe, and our identity or our sense of self, how we know ourselves, is this very process of circulation. What we call identification, or what we call identity, or knowing ourselves, it's not only a personal experience. Rather, it's a relationship. In fact, it's a circulation and a process of communion or communication. Literally, it's identity, it's identification. Not only is there a connection between our life and that of our galaxy and universe, not only is there a connection, but our lives, we are that connection. A study of the structure of the universe at any level, large or small, is a study of ourself, and the guidelines of cosmic structure, learning about them, help to illustrate the specific structure of ourself, our lives. So in summary, the idea that I'm unfolding here is that astrology is not only a symbolic system of, for psychological discussion. What I'm saying is that it's not just symbolic, or rather the symbol is also in fact, literally real. If we say it is an analogy, then that analogy is complete down to the limits of any specific example we might choose. We're all time and space travelers. There are no better words that I know than these of Emerson from his essay on history, And I'll just quote from it. Quote, "All inquiry into antiquity is the desire to do away with this wild, savage, and preposterous there or then, and introduce in its place the here and the now." Belzoni, an archaeologist, digs and measures in the mummy pits and pyramids of Thebes until he can see the end of the difference between the monstrous work and himself. When he has satisfied himself in general and in detail that this was made by such a person as he, so armed and so motivated, and to the same ends to which he himself should have also worked, then the problem is solved. His thought lives along the whole line of temples and sphinxes and catacombs, passes through all of them with satisfaction, and they live again to the mind, or are now. End quote. So a process of self-discovery awaits those who would inquire into the nature and structure of this universe. We may read and study the history and the records of astrology through all of the books that we have, and we can return again and again to our favorite passages, like I quoted above, to make sure of what we've found there. But sooner or later, each of us must turn away from the book, and we must just go and live our life. That's why we study astrology in the first place. As my Dharma teacher once said to me, "Michael, someday you must become the book." And we each must become the book. And only that lives in reality which we have known for ourselves to have life, which we have personally lived. And as Shakespeare said in one of his early sonnets, quote, "You are no more yourself than you now here live," end quote. And the philosopher Hegel said the same thing in another way in his main book, which is called The Phenomenology of the Mind. Quote, "We go behind the curtain of the self to see what's there, but mainly for there to be something to be seen," end quote. Now, there's great value in a reading of the ancient wisdom and all the documents that are there. What the ancients saw or discovered about themselves, that truth, it's still true today. All of the laws of the universe still exist to be known today. And we're always free to leave off at reading about our life and cast off into an inquiry, our own inquiry, and to live that life, the life that we just have read about. We can learn to know, we can learn to experience what we're talking or reading about. Okay, now I'm going to get more down to earth. What it all means. With the rise of space travel and ever, new, more powerful telescopes, man has himself literally stepped out into space. He has gone beyond himself in a fresh inquiry into the nature of his existence. What does this mean for astrologers? As astrologers, we have a habit of associating or reflecting outward celestial events, astronomy, with a simultaneous change within ourselves. The array of recent astrophysical events and discoveries over the last 50 years are so great that they may tax even our imagination. In fact, man's understanding of the nature of his universe, of this universe, and thus himself, has changed in recent years beyond any memory of change that history can offer as a guide. In other words, we're in new territory here. I can remember when cosmic food for thought was still kind of rare, and the use of the astrological imagination, actually had to be encouraged. back in the 1950s. However, the more recent deluge of fascinating astrophysical information in the last many decades has had the effect of curbing our imagination, maybe perhaps even limiting our inquiry to the simple available facts. At least at this time in history, the facts are more inspiring than any flight of the imagination, or, as it has been repeatedly said, the facts are indeed stranger than fiction. In recent years, astrologers have turned from an age-old, very active state of receiving astronomical information, we've been essentially passive in that, to a bold, active inquiry into the nature of outer space. And thus we've also turned to look into ourselves, or our God, or our awareness, whatever words we want to use. It's happening out there in space, this discovery, this astrophysical discovery, but it's also happening down here within ourselves through depth psychology, and the spread of many spiritual, quote, new age, unquote, disciplines, or what have you. And an astrological approach to the discoveries of modern astrophysics is quite simple. In fact, it can be reduced simply to a study of the life and death struggle of stars and the various kinds of light that they produce. In fact, it would seem that we can gaze on life and death of stars more candidly than we dare to examine our own. So with this in mind, let's take a look here at some of these facts and the ideas or interpretations they seem to generate or suggest. None of what I say here, this interpretive speculation, is intended to be dogmatic. It's simply a first attempt, on my part at least, to arrange or order some of this new material and to get at least some sense of what it means for the astrology of the future and for the present time. In fact, I will not offer too much by way of interpretation because the facts speak for themselves. So let them guide your imagination, your interpretation. With the advent of deep space astrology, a question that comes up often is, how in the world do we interpret all of these many new objects like black holes and pulsars, quasars, and all of that stuff? Now, putting these objects aside just for the moment, we might ask, well, how have astrologers dealt with all the myriad of stellar points that we have known about for many hundreds or thousands of years? Points like the named stars, novae, globular clusters, and so on. And the simple truth is that as astrologers, we've pretty much ignored all celestial objects beyond our solar system. There are some few books, or good books, on the fixed stars. I agree with that. But for the most part, these are little more than an attempt to carry forward ancient Arabic, Greek, Chinese, etc. notations. And even they only address a relatively few stars, when really there's millions and millions of them. So how do you deal with that? For example, we might read that the red giant star, called Antares, pertains to eyesight and so forth. And altogether, these, at least the ones that are commonly used in Western astrology, the fixed stars, they amount to only a handful of stars, no more than would fit in a very small book, if not a pamphlet. So my point is that we not only need to find interpretations for some of these exotic new deep space objects, like black holes, but what about all of the well-known stars and other visual stellar objects that have been around for thousands of years? They also beg for some clarity. In fact, any attempt to notate and interpret these long-known visual objects in some kind of linear fashion, one by one, is just inherently doomed to failure. So another way to put this might be that all over the centuries we have already done our best to make a linear count of all these, all the fixed stars. And the sum total of what we have to say interpretively as astrologers about all of the various visual stars and objects would not even fill a small booklet. I think that in itself says a lot. So perhaps it's time to take another approach. And the approach that I suggest is nothing new for astronomers, but it might be just what we astrologers are looking for. In fact, it's exactly that approach that astronomers have used for hundreds of years, which is simply to group individual objects of a similar nature together. Instead of trying to find what is unique about a particular object, like I mentioned the fixed star Antares, and it supposedly affects eyesight, etc., instead look for what stellar objects share in common, group them, and then go from there. For example, all novae are exploding stars, and all novae share this attribute. And we can speculate how a novae might relate to a natal chart and so on. If we do come up with an interpretation for exploding stars, then that would also work to some degree for all known and all yet to be discovered novae. Anyway, I'm sure you get the idea. To ask the simple question, to what group does this or that star belong? And as astrologers, we can agree that what's happening out there, whether with the planets or objects that are much farther away, like pulsars, whatever is happening out there is also being acted out now, down here on Earth. There's no curtain separating us from that, from out there. In fact, we are out there. That's the thing you need to understand when you want to learn about this stuff, is we already are out there, and we're an equal representative. We're not some anomaly. We are what we are, right? Another way of phrasing this concept is that we're already in the middle of all that. We live in the solar system, which lives in the local system, which lives in the galaxy, and so forth. So we're right in there now, and we've always been there. Quote, as above, so below, end quote, is the key phrase here. What is writ large across the heavens is acted out, albeit in a small way, here on Earth. I mean, this is what most astrology is all about. And if we can't agree on this, I suggest that you don't read any farther or listen to me. If you're still with me, then not only the planets, aspects, and astrological houses have meaning in our lives, but all of the many myriads of stellar objects also have meaning in our lives. By finding what group an object belongs to will tell us something about how to go about interpreting that object. And the only real difference between the old set of visual astronomical objects, the fixed stars, and the newer astrophysical or deep space objects like black holes, is that many of the new objects don't appear to our eyes. That's a big point. They don't shine in the visual spectrum, but rather they shine in some other part of the electromagnetic spectrum, be it through radio emissions on the low end, infrared beneath the visual portions of the spectrum, or X-ray or gamma ray emissions on the high end, above the visual spectrum. But shine they do. What we have then is a multitude of stellar objects that are all shining. But they're shining throughout the entire electromagnetic spectrum, all the way from dim radio emissions on the low end, on through infrared, and through the visual spectrum that we know, and then on to X-ray and gamma ray emissions on the high end. So it's this complete set of objects that we seek to examine here and look for meaning in our astrological charts, the ones that figure prominently, in our chart, in our nativity. Now, putting aside the visual stars and objects for the moment, what really is so different about these new deep space objects? As mentioned earlier, perhaps the main difference, as I pointed out, is that they've been literally unseen until now. They just popped up on our radar. They were always there, but we were not aware of them because they shine at frequencies which our eyes cannot see. There are objects that shine below the visual part of the spectrum, like infrared stars and the like. And even lower yet are the radio, other infrared objects that just kind of sit out there and dimly glow. But we can measure them now. We see them now. And then there are objects that are faster and shine at higher frequencies than the visual spectrum, objects like X-ray sources or gamma ray emissions. It's this factor, that's where we should look for our interpretations. Now, I can only tell you my experience with these deep space points over the last 30 or 40 years. Emissions below the visual spectrum, below what we can see with our eyes, seem to measure the general shape of the cosmos, the body, the basic form of the surrounding universe. These low emissions, these radio and infrared objects, when taken together, when seen as a whole, paint a picture of the general cosmic structure in which the visual stars that we've known for so long are embedded or fixed. And they're not like diamonds in the sky. They're an integral part of a larger structure that they're like the tip of the iceberg. They're not separate from the iceberg. As for how to interpret this structure, I find that it's similar to what we would call psychic. These are subconscious areas of our mind and life, areas beneath our visual conscious mind, and fairly obvious. Whole areas of the sky, such as the galactic center, around 26 degrees of the tropical sign Sagittarius, they have very much more structure, more shape, and emissions than do other areas, such as the area opposite from the galaxy center, which would be 26 degrees of the tropical zodiac Gemini. But even the anti-center of the galaxy contains a lot of material, because our sun and our solar system, it's not all the way to the edge of the galaxy, of our galaxy. If you want to look for the direction that actually has the least material, it's 0 degrees of the tropical zodiac Aries. Now that direction is relatively very empty. It's in the subconscious, our own subconscious, that we learn to feel our way around. And individuals who have psychic talent and skills, well, perhaps they make it much easier for us to do this. When some of these major radio stars figure prominently, like in your natal chart, this is a sure sign of some sort of synergy with our reaching into our subconscious, some psychic ability. Light shining beneath the visual spectrum is more like feeling around for the structure of our life, much like the proverbial blind man feels an elephant's leg. We learn to feel our way around in those areas where we can't see. Now, at the other end of the visual spectrum, this, above the visual spectrum, higher, fast, high-energy sources, they shine at ultraviolet and X-ray frequencies. Now, this is a very different kind of light. It doesn't describe or invoke the shape of the universe, but it's just the reverse. This high-energy emission cuts right through the radio and also through the visual, cuts through those forms, those pictures, exposing only the very essential point sources of energy. Some high-energy emissions actually look right through matter itself, just like X-rays do in the dentist chair. So, if you have any high-energy point sources in your natal chart, like black holes, quasars, or X-ray sources, and if they're prominently configured in your chart, then perhaps you have the ability to see right to the heart of things. Analytical skills, cutting through any obscurations, any shadows, and getting right down to it. This X-ray vision, Superman had it, is a perfect complement to the more feeling and psychic talents that we find at the other end of the spectrum. So you can take your pick. As for practical uses for these two parts of the spectrum, when life gets too cold and theoretical, get together with someone with a strong radio, psychic points in their chart. This is just my interpretation, just to help you get started. They will help you. These psychic type people, they'll help you to ground yourself or to feel more like yourself again. And these types are great for dinner parties or just having a good time. But on the other hand, when life gets too much, and you suddenly have more on your plate than you can handle, get close to someone with high energy points, X-rays, X-ray sources, black holes. There's someone that has these points prominently in their chart. I find that it will make it easier for you to cut through the crap and see clearly what's important, what's not, and what needs to be done. So I hope these general interpretive comments, are helpful in beginning to approach these new deep space objects. And I've only given you a very brief overview. It can be absolutely fascinating to read about each kind of object, noting their specific qualities, especially if they figure in your natal chart. For example, black holes are super high energy sources, with incredible power at the high end of the electromagnetic spectrum. Their life story is just amazing to read about. Perhaps you have one conjunct your natal sun or any other key part of your chart. I would read with great care everything I could about such objects, because you learn about yourself. And I've not forgotten the visual objects that we've observed for centuries, such as, the standard fixed and named stars. By this point, you should pretty much know what I'm going to say here. These visual points, they're no different as regards interpretation. In fact, they've been around for hundreds of years in full sight, thousands of years visually. We've all seen them virtually forever, because they're right out there in the open. So treat them the same as you would any deep space point. And by that I mean, instead of trying to come up with personal idiosyncrasies for each fixed star, or be forced to read about what the ancient people said about the stars, and try to remember it, instead find out what group they belong in, and think about what that might mean. For example, is a particular fixed star that's prominent in your chart, is it a young, bright blue star? Or is it an old, dying red star? Now that much is easy to figure out just by looking up its spectral type. and read about the life progression of stars, because all deep space astrology is nothing more nor less than the life and death story of stars. Every last object is a star in some part of their life, some part of their lifespan, much as we are somewhere in ours. So what more of a hint do you need? If you will approach all stellar objects in this way, you can learn a lot about them. If they can figure strongly in your natal chart, you can read about the whole class of objects and learn something about yourself in the bargain.